Hey everybody, thank you very much for subscribing to LA Lim channel. It is a beautiful day in Los Angeles today, and welcome to episode 2 of my greatest albums of all time weekly series that I'm doing on the LA Lim channel. Last week the series debuted with the 1971 anthem album by Marvin Gaye called What's Going On. And in the coming weeks, I'm going to be talking about several albums that were released that I feel that were amongst the greatest albums ever recorded. I was lucky and fortunate enough to grow up in the 70s at a period where there were some great albums released by great artists. And I feel very fortunate and feel sorry for the younger people who live in a time now where albums and entire albums and songs on those albums, whether they're single releases or just album tracks or not, do not have the same importance that they did back in the 70s. But like anything, there's always has to be something before that. And before the great albums of the 70s could be released, those albums were born from the great albums of the 60s. And there was one recording artist that I feel is responsible for albums being taken seriously as the great and artistic forms of musical expression that they were. I'm talking about in 1967, the summer of 67. Meant many things to many different people. Where I grew up, it was a period of great social unrest. But also the summer of 1967 for the counterculture youth. The summer of 67 was called the Summer of Love. And the album that represented the Summer of Love more than any album released in 1967 was the great album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, released by the Beatles. I think it's safe to say that the Beatles are probably the most popular recording act in music history. They came out of England in the 60s. They, in 1964, ushered in what was called the British Invasion. And their period between 1964 and 65, when they were in a period known as Beatlemania, was probably their most very popular period amongst fandom throughout the world. They could just do no wrong amongst their fans. But by 1966, the wheels started coming off a little bit. The inevitable backlash began to follow worldwide. Starting off in the summer of 1966, but before that, in the spring of 1966, each one of the Beatles did an individual interview with a London columnist named Maureen Cleave, where she interviewed each Beatle, titled "How Does This Beatle Live?" John Lennon, the Beatle who was called the intelligent Beatle, the smart Beatle, gave a far-ranging interview, and in that interview he talked about his dissatisfaction with the decline of religion, particularly amongst young people in England. And in a quote throughout a long passage of what he was talking about, he said that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, referring to the youth in England. And it actually it could be said that what John Lennon said was arguably true, particularly for the people in England, which was not the religious state that the United States was. When John Lennon gave that interview, an interview was published in London, it didn't occasion any particular comment from people. But in the summer of 1966, a teenage magazine called Datebook released that quote out of context, and it made it seem as though John Lennon was boasting that the Beatles were better than Jesus Christ. And They suffered an enormous backlash in America, album burnings and protests with the Beatles, to the point that they decided after their tour in 1966 that they were no longer going to tour again. So what do they do now? What is their next step as far as their musical evolution? Well, their next step was creating a symphonic masterpiece. And that masterpiece was called Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The recording of that started in November of 1966 with John Lennon's great masterpiece of a song called Strawberry Fields Forever, followed shortly by Paul McCartney's exquisite Penny Lane. Both of those albums, because they had a contract with EMI in England that they have to have had a single release, both of those songs were released in February 1967, and because of that, they were summarily left off the Sgt. Pepper's album, for which George Martin has always said was his biggest regret, that those songs didn't appear on that album. The album itself released in England on June 1st, 1967, and June 2nd in the United States, was an enormously popular album in 1967, and probably their most popular and most well-known album. Starting off with the title song and such great songs as We Get By With a Little Help from Our Friends, Lovely Rita, and the finality of this album, the final cut on the album, a song that many people feel was the ultimate John Lennon-Paul McCartney collaboration, a song called A Day in the Life. And that song went something like this. I read the news today, oh boy, about a lucky man who made the grade. He blew his mind out in a car. He didn't notice that the lights had changed. A crowd of people stood and stared. They seen his face before. Nobody was really sure if he was from the House of Lords. Some people say that was the ultimate John Lennon-Paul McCartney collaboration, and I tend to agree with them. A great finish for a great album, A Day in the Life, on the album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. That album won the Grammy Award for the best album of 1967. Beatle music historians and the revisioning of history will probably have looked back and have determined that that was not their best album. The consensus of most Beatle historians that their best album was the album that was released 1 year before, in 1966, an album called Revolver. I personally feel my favorite album by the Beatles was the last album that they recorded as a band in 1969, called Abbey Road. And amongst the great songs on that album, I feel that that album is the album that George Harrison finally arrived as a songwriter of equal stature to John Lennon and Paul McCartney. And if you wonder what I mean about that, just listen to George Harrison's great songs on that album, Something and Here Comes the Sun. Unlike the What's Going On album that I profiled last week, that I think is an album that has stood the test of time and is still as relevant as far as what it talks about, what it speaks about, and the sound of it 46 years later. Sgt. Pepper is probably an album that is more of its time. The sounds that were created for that album on Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, the Sgt. Pepper, sound very much like the sound of 1967, and in my opinion don't hold up very well in today's time because sound is so different, though it was a masterpiece of an album. And that is the album that I am featuring this week on the greatest albums of all time. The great album from 1967, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles. Next week I'm going to feature my second favorite album from 1967. So be looking for that. And in the coming weeks we're going to be talking about some of the great albums of the 70s, and there were a lot of them. So I thank you all so much. Music is a passion of mine. I'm a music person. I'm a lyrics person. I like to read what's behind the lyric and interpret it and so on. And I am an album person, so I am pleased and happy to share my love for albums in this weekly series, Greatest Albums of All Time. So be looking for that. As always, I leave you with what I always say, which is love is life. Love everyone, and for all of the bad things and all of the evil things that's been happening in the past week, all of these senseless, unnecessary killings, let's show some real, true agape love to people today. Be a blessing to someone today, people. Love you all. Ciao, Bella.